Okay. I think there are probably a few people who are still trickling in, but in the interest of giving our speaker as much time as possible today, I think we will go ahead and get started. My name is Corey Kleinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and I'm joining all of you today from my office in the Fisher Fine Arts building on Penn's campus. And I'm really delighted that we have the opportunity to bring you this event today, which is going to explore exactly how far we are from meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So to do that, we're going to focus on the UNEP Emissions Gap Report, which comes out annually and looks at what the estimated future global greenhouse gas emissions would be. Sorry, something just happened to my screen. There we go. Would be if countries implement what are known as their nationally determined contributions. So the things that they said that they're going to do under the Paris Agreement, plus any additional climate mitigation pledges that they've made outside of the kind of official process. So the report looks at what's necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, which I think we all know is to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and then hopefully to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the report calculates the gap between the targets and the pledges that have been made and what's actually necessary to limit global warming. And this is super timely right now because last year in Glasgow at COP26, new nationally determined contributions were made by countries, which meant that this emissions gap report of 2021 was an especially important signal for whether or not we're on track to meet our goals. And today, to talk about all this with us, we're joined by Anne Olhoff. So Anne is an international senior advisor at Concito, which is a green think tank in Denmark. She has several decades of experience in international policy, both on the technical assistance side and then on research in climate mitigation and adaptation, all of this kind of in the context of sustainable development. Anne's been heavily involved in 2 different UNEP reports. So the emissions gap report that we're going to talk about today, and then also the adaptation gap report. And I had the pleasure of hearing a version of this presentation in Glasgow a couple months ago. So I know that you are in for a real treat, and I think I am too, because I understand that there have been several pieces of this that have been updated since then. Just a couple pieces of housekeeping. Anne's going to present for about 30 minutes, and then that's going to be followed by a moderated Q&A. If you want to submit a question for the Q&A, I'm going to ask that you post it in the Q&A function in Zoom. So that's what I'm going to be monitoring and pulling questions from. You can use the chat function for any additional conversation amongst yourselves and also for sharing resources with each other, but the questions need to go in the Q&A. And then just a quick note about a couple upcoming events at the center. So next month in April, we're hosting another Energy Week at Penn. That's going to be from April 4th to 8th. We've got a whole host of featured events, including an alumni panel, a networking event, a panel on renewable energy and indigenous communities, and then a moderated conversation with our favorite science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson. You can find all of that, all of the events and the registration information at energyweek.upenn.edu. We can put that in the chat for you. And then on April 19th, I'm very happy to invite you to our 7th annual Carnot Prize award ceremony, which recognizes someone who has made distinguished contributions to energy policy. And this year, we're very pleased that the recipient of that award is going to economist Nicholas Stern. And you can register for that event on our website, kleinmanenergy.upenn.edu, which we'll also put in the chat. So I think that covers things for me. Questions go in the Q&A, sign up for our upcoming events. And now I'm going to hand it over to Anne to start her presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Corey. And I'm just starting to share my screen. Shout out if you can't see it. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk about how far we are from the goals of the Paris Agreement, but hopefully also how we can get closer to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as Corey mentioned, this presentation is largely based on the key findings of the latest UNEP Emissions Gap Report, which was launched just a week before the COP26 in Glasgow. And these reports are produced annually and released annually before the climate talks as independent science-based assessment to inform the international discussions on climate change. And the process is quite sort of elaborate. We build author teams for each of the chapters with lead authors, contributing authors. We have a steering committee that guides the process. Everything undergoes external review in several rounds usually. And also the governments of the countries that are specifically mentioned in the report also get a chance to look at the preliminary findings and results and comment on these ahead of the publication of the report. But before we go into the findings of this year's report, or last year's report rather, let's look a little bit at the history of the emissions gap reports. And as you can see on the top picture, the gloomy faces in Copenhagen, at the COP in Copenhagen, where everybody hoped that there would be signed a global deal on climate change. It didn't happen, but the Copenhagen COP did succeed in signing what was called the Copenhagen Accord, where countries voluntarily put forward emission reduction pledges, or some countries did, for 2020. And with that, a central question arose, which was more specifically, are those pledges sufficient to bring global emissions to the level that is required to limit global warming to a certain degree? And of course, the answer was no. And so subsequent reports also started looking into what can we then do to bridge this gap between where we're headed and where we need to be. If you look at the left bottom corner, faces looked more enthusiastic in Paris in 2015, where we did succeed in getting the global agreement on climate change, the Paris Agreement, which it did also specify the goal in more detail, and a stricter goal, as Corey mentioned, to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius at the end of this century. So following that, the emissions gap reports have looked at the emissions gap, both with respect to below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees every year since 2015. Corey also mentioned that what was particularly interesting last year when we did the latest report is, first of all, that it's the first time since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the countries were actually requested to update their pledges for 2030, their nationally determined contributions. And also the UK COP presidency had a special focus on limiting global warming, or keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and ensuring global net zero emissions by around mid-century. So against that background, the report, or some of the key questions of the report, was, first of all, where are we in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions? Where are we headed if countries implement their pledges for 2030? And where should we be in 2030 according to science to have a likely chance, which is at least 66% of the getting on track to 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees respectively. We also looked then at the implications for global warming at the end of the century, and we looked specifically into the status of the net zero emission pledges and whether these pledges that countries are putting forward for 2030 are aligned with the longer term ambition to reach net zero emissions. And then every year we look into new areas of ways or opportunities to bridge the emissions gap. And last year we looked into the role of COVID-19 fiscal recovery measures. As we all know, the fiscal recovery spending has been unprecedented and also presents a large opportunity for low carbon development. And we looked into whether that opportunity is seized or not. Then we had a special focus on methane emissions, which were at the core of many of the discussions in Glasgow as well, and also on the role of market mechanisms, again reflecting the large focus on the Article 6 under the Paris Agreement on market mechanisms. So if we start by looking at greenhouse gas emissions globally, what we saw up until 2019 were that these had been increasing about 1.5% per year for the last decade. Then we saw an unprecedented drop in global CO2 emissions of about 5.4% in 2020. We didn't have all the data available for the other greenhouse gases, but the total drop in emissions was expected to be smaller than the drop in CO2 emissions. At the same time, we also saw that emissions were picking up again, and a strong rebound was expected in 2021. We didn't have the final data, we still don't, but as many of you have probably seen, the IEA came out with a report just the other week showing that actually CO2 emissions in 2021 were higher than back in 2019. So let's turn to the new and updated nationally determined contributions that countries submitted ahead of the COP. And actually last year we were particularly busy because the report only came out the week before COP, but then countries were busy and making new announcements regarding both their pledges for 2030 and in some cases also net zero emission pledges later in the century. So during COP, we did an update to the emissions gap report, and I've included the most recent, the most updated numbers here. So what we can see is that if we look at the country's pledges, there is progress in many ways. So by now we have 81% of global emissions covered by the NDCs. We see that more than 60% of these actually had lower or have lower emissions in 2030 compared to the prior NDCs. Some of them have equal or higher emissions, and that's mainly due to changes in the underlying way in which they estimate the emissions. And in some cases, the effects on global emissions were unclear, and that was mainly because the new or the latest nationally determined contributions were more transparent than the prior ones. So they included more detail and were not directly comparable. However, if we look at the aggregate impact of these new pledges on projected global greenhouse gases in 2030, that aggregate impact is somewhat limited. In total, they are estimated to lead to a reduction in 2030 of about 4.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents compared with the prior pledges. The new statements and that came out from countries from the launch of the report until the COP resulted in about 0.7 gigatons of CO2 emission reductions in 2030 compared to the report. What you see over here to the left is basically the contributions of each of the major emitters, the G20 members, in their new and updated NDCs. So this also means that while there has been progress, the emissions gap in 2030 remains large. And let me walk you quickly through the graph there, as it's fairly busy. So if we start from the top, that's what we usually call the feel-good story. We see the 2010 policy scenario, and that basically tells us where would emissions in 2030 be had no new climate policies been introduced since 2010. As we can see that when we go to the next scenario, the current policy scenario, which is basically then updating the impact of policies introduced and implemented since 2010, that has had a significant effect in terms of the estimated 2030 emissions and lowering them. We then look at the nationally determined contributions, and we have two scenarios. One is the unconditional NDC scenario, which is basically what countries are promising to do without any strings attached. And then the conditional NDC scenarios, some countries have put forward pledges where they said they would do something in addition, provided that they're given technical or financial support, or provided that others do some more as well. But no matter how we turn it, there's still a significant gap between all of these scenarios, and the 2 degree, 1.8 degree, and 1.5 degree scenario that you see at the bottom. Sorry, and these basically show where science tells us we need to be in terms of global emissions in 2030 to have a likely chance of getting on a path to below 2 degrees and to 1.5 degrees. So overall, if we look at the unconditional NDCs, they lower emissions in 2030 by around 8% compared to the previous NDCs, but we would need 4 times higher ambition to get on track to 2 degrees, and we would need 7 times higher ambition to get on track to 1.5 degrees. So the emissions gap here is quite big. With the updated numbers, it's between 9 and 12.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent to 2 degrees, and between 23.5 and 27 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with respect to a 1.5 degree goal. So just to give you maybe a sense of the size here, we need to halve global emissions between now and 2030 to get on track to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This doesn't take into account the new net zero emission pledges that have been made by an increasing number of countries. I've left some of the text here in orange because it basically shows the changes between when we released the report and then when we did the update during COP. But by now they cover 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see that almost all the G20 countries have net zero pledges by now, and also that there is progress in terms of putting them into law, putting them into policy documents and so forth. But we also see that there are still a number of common ambiguities in terms of sectors and gases covered, whether they are including offsets and whether they're including international aviation and shipping emissions, and also the transparency regarding the plans for achieving these goals and for reporting and reviewing progress against them. So if we look at the global warming implications under these different scenarios, we see that if we just follow the current policies, we would probably end up at around 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Unconditional full implementation of the unconditional NDCs would just lower this by 0.1 degrees Celsius to 2.7 degrees Celsius. And we really need to go into full implementation, both of the promises for 2030 and the promises regarding net zero emissions, which together, if fully implemented, would bring us down to global warming of 2.1 degrees Celsius with a 66% chance. So we need full implementation, both of the 2030 pledges, but first of all, we need to move towards net zero emissions if we are to get closer to achieving the Paris Agreement goals. And we need to get there. So if we look at the G20 countries, they are neither on track to achieve their original pledges for 2030 or their new 2030 pledges. And here you can see just how they are grouped in terms of whether they have submitted stronger targets or not, and whether they are assessed to be on track based both on official studies and independent studies to achieve respectively their prior targets and their updated targets. And what might be particularly interesting here is that amongst the ones that have submitted stronger targets, we see that both the United States of America and Canada are actually assessed to even miss their previous targets, indicating that we need to accelerate and beef up both the policies and the implementation of those policies to be able to meet their targets for 2030. It's always very difficult to assess whether countries are doing well or not so well, and there are many factors to take into consideration. For instance, you might put forward a not very ambitious target, in which case it's easy to be on track to achieving it, or conversely, you might put forward a very ambitious target, in which case it could be good to actually not be on track to reaching it yet. And what you can say, of course, is that it would have been disappointing in many ways if the new and updated NDC targets, if the G20 countries were already on track to achieving those with the current policies. So it's also indicating the ambition level in this. Furthermore, if we look at the net zero emission pledges, we see that few of the G20 members are currently on a clear pathway towards those net zero targets. And we did it for the G20 countries for which the information was available. What we simply did was to plot the 2030 target and then the net zero pledge for each of these countries. And if the 2030 target is higher than the dotted line, it basically means that emissions are still expected to be increasing up until 2030, which means that it will be more difficult subsequently to reduce emissions fast enough to actually reach net zero later in the century. So basically, there is an urgent need both to enhance ambition, but also to accelerate action to bridge the emissions gap and to set global emissions on a credible path towards net zero. Then we turn to opportunities to bridge the emissions gap. And if we look at the COVID-19 fiscal measures, we also included a chapter on this in the 2020 Emissions Gap Report. And we see that approximately 16.7 trillion US had been spent on COVID-19 related both rescue and recovery packages until May last year. And only 2.25 trillion of those are considered recovery spending, and only 17 to 19% of those 2.25 trillion are actually assessed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not doing too well in terms of using the opportunity of the fiscal recovery spending to accelerate a transition to a low carbon future. It's important to mention here that some of the spending that's not included, while it may not directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the short run, it can contribute to reductions in the slightly longer term, as it may enable transitions in a slightly longer time frame. And you can see some examples here of low carbon measures that could be included, and also of high carbon measures that some countries have included as part of their fiscal recovery spending. Turning to methane, the important thing about methane emissions is, of course, that they can slow down the rate of warming in the short term. They can also reduce peak warming during the century, and then they can help bridge the emissions gap. And there's a huge untapped potential, which some of the discussions during the COP also centered on, and we also saw a new sectoral announcement regarding methane emissions. But if we look at the NDCs, they only cover about 1/3 of the methane reduction that's required to be consistent with a 2-degree pathway, and 23% of what is needed for 1.5-degree goal. And we see the major areas where methane emission reductions can be realized within fossil fuel, especially extraction, and within agriculture, including changing rice growing patterns and so forth, and finally in waste. Finally, we looked into market mechanisms, and of course market mechanisms are interesting as their use has the potential to reduce the overall costs of introducing mitigation measures. But it clearly depends on rules, and on rules being very clearly defined, and that they reflect actual reductions in emissions, and that they're supported by arrangements to both track progress and provide transparency. As we all know, there was a clarity on Article 6, and I still think that we need to wait and see what it will result in, and the potential it will have to get countries to reduce emissions further and faster. So let me end here by looking ahead a little bit. If we look at the Glasgow Climate Pact, it was interesting that countries were actually asked to submit new NDCs, new targets for 2030 already this year. Let's see how many will do so. A lot of the major economies actually came out and said they had no intention of revisiting this year, as they had just submitted a stronger NDC. But also there was this decision to have high-level ministerials on enhancing pre-2030 ambition, and the first will be held this year in relation to COP27. So we also saw a number of other things coming out of Glasgow, and including a new focus on putting together packages that could help interested countries in, for instance, transitioning out of coal faster than they would otherwise. So there was this, and there's interest this year in furthering these types of collaborations between different nations that can help speed up a transition, for instance, out of coal. It could be other examples as well. Then just mentioning very briefly, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then their 6th assessment cycle. The first report came out in August last year on the science base, clearly showing that that impacts and that climate change is happening faster than we thought. We have the Working Group 2 report came out a few weeks ago looking into adaptation and impacts of climate change, and really underlying that the only chance we have of really limiting the risks and impacts of climate change to levels that are manageable are through strong and really accelerated mitigation as well. And then on the 4th of April, we have the 3rd report coming out, the mitigation report, which will echo much of what is in the emissions gap report, and of course provide more detail and further detail. So I think this year there's a strong push through the science basis for action, and also let's see how that is received. In terms of the plans for this year's emissions gap report, we are underway. We have plans to look at topics that are particularly interesting this year. Of course, we will update the emissions gap as always. We will look more into more detail on how we can assess net zero emission pledges, progress towards them, and the alignment of short-term and long-term action. And in the second part of the report, we will have a special focus and some cross-cutting questions around how to accelerate not only the ambition, but the implementation aspects, given that this is really where the focus needs to be. So let me end here, and thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
That was great, Anne. Thank you so much. I'm going to remind folks, if you can post your questions in the Q&A, that's going to be the most efficient way for us to make our way through them. I can kick off. I just have a couple questions that I can start with. One is a clarifying question, Anne. I think we have a pretty varied audience, and I'm wondering if you can spend just a moment maybe clarifying a little bit about what the progress specifically was made on Article 6, and how that's going to kind of shape the market mechanisms that we think about when we think about carbon markets in the future. Yeah, so basically Article 6 was the only thing that wasn't yet agreed, or where no agreement had been made. So it was getting all the clarifications regarding what would be covered, how would you report on it, what would be the reporting formats, and so forth agreed. So that's basically what happened during COP. I don't think anybody has a good overview, at least I certainly don't, of what the implications will be in terms of direct effects on emissions so far. But it does set up the framework for how to use markets as a way to reduce emissions and also increase ambition. And it's been something that especially developing countries have paid quite a lot of attention to, because they also see it as a way of providing, of receiving technical support and technology transfer and so forth. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we have a question, a little bit of conversation going on in the Q&A, specifically about Ukraine. So the question is, how will the Ukraine crisis impact the ability to reach emissions targets? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Well, what we see here, a lot of the discussion in the EU right now, or in Europe, is basically on how will
how will this affect, for instance, gas, use of gas, gas markets, and a lot of push to move out of Russian gas. So if it's mainly used as a means to then flare up more gas in other places, it doesn't help. But if it's used as as an opportunity to accelerate a transition towards renewable energy, it could have some implications. It could be seen as well, it's basically another disruption. We saw COVID as it was a major disruption. Ukraine could be another major disruption, and you can use it either in positive or less positive ways in the climate on the climate scene. But of course, this is going to be challenging in terms of the negotiations with Russia having a whole new role yeah. So I'm not sure how it's going to affect. To be honest.
Yeah. There's another question specifically about carbon taxes. So essentially about how big a carbon tax would have to be if it was going to really change the emissions curve.
Well, there's been quite a lot of literature on optimal and carbon taxes and on social price of carbon. And now my memory is failing me. So, but what we need to see is of course, significantly higher carbon taxes if we really want to affect the emissions than we have now. I can look into it, but I'm afraid I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. But we do see is that there's significant emission reduction potential at the cost below $100 per ton of carbon. So taxes that are in that order would actually enable huge emission reductions.
Yeah. So another question just on how you're calculating this emissions gap. So why is it, so if a country makes a pledge, like a net zero pledge, that's outside of the official UNFCCC process, right? If the process that the UNFCCC is following is voluntary anyway, why would a country choose to make a pledge that is outside of their nationally determined contribution? And how does UNEP, I mean, it sounds like UNEP treats those, right, as part of the contribution in a way, but how did UNEP make that decision and why?
Well, we had a lot of discussions about that last year. Also, whether we should include announcements regarding 2030 pledges that were not yet formally submitted to the UNFCCC or not. What is in the UNFCCC process, and we might change it this year, is that countries are requested to submit the low emissions development strategies further out into the future. And few countries have actually submitted those, or at least updated those recently. But it is expected that eventually many countries will turn their net zero emissions pledges into low emissions development strategies and also submit them under the UNFCCC. So we can't of course estimate an emissions gap, but of course these net zero emission pledges are absolutely crucial, because we know according to science that CO2 emissions globally need to be around net zero in 2050, and then all greenhouse gases need to reach net zero about 20 years later. So it was more sort of a yardstick in that sense to say, okay, this is what countries have promised, and we only included those countries that have officially stated that they have a net zero emission target. So we don't include it in any sort of formal calculation of the emissions gap, but we do take it into account when we look at the global temperature increase at the end of the century, and we also used it as a yardstick against the 2030 pledges and whether they were sort of aligned with longer term net zero.
So let me ask you two related follow-up questions on that. So one is, how many, or do you look at in the report, because I think you might, how many nations actually back up something like a net zero pledge with national policy or law in your analysis?
Well, you can see I think what we saw last year, and I had that slide with the small graphs for each of the G20 countries that we had the information available for. And I think there is a tendency towards a larger sort of divergence between emerging economies and what we call developed economies, where many of for instance, the EU and others are more on track because they've already turned around. They have peaked their emissions. They are on a downward trend in terms of emissions. So we see a larger sort of degree of compatibility with the longer term net zero goals in many of those economies than in the economies where they're still developing more and haven't peaked their emissions yet.
Yeah, and that leads me to another question I have here in this side chat, which is really about the difference between developed and developing countries when it comes to the emissions gap. You spoke a little bit about the G20, but how are the developing countries really faring when it comes to this analysis?
I think we need to differentiate between different types of developing countries here. Mm-hmm. So overall, if we look at global emissions and we divide it by the official rules for what is a developing country and what is a developed country, nowadays about 25% of global emissions are from so-called developed countries, whereas the remaining 75% are actually from countries classified as developing countries, which illustrates, and of course that doesn't take the whole historical burden into consideration, but it illustrates that if we want to solve this climate crisis, we can't do it without engagement of all countries, including developing countries. And then of course you have big emitters amongst the developing countries, including Brazil and China, and you also have a huge number of countries with minuscule emissions that have neither been part of the problem and will not be a huge part of the solution in terms of reducing emissions, but are nevertheless the ones that will be hit hardest and already are hit the hardest in terms of climate change and climate change impacts.
Yeah, that's great. I think you're right, that is an important distinction to make. So I love this question. This is wonderful. It seems like ambitions need to be reframed as commitments as the gap continues to widen. Can you share, even if it's just anecdotally, some good news or progress that can be viewed as some form of success?
I think there are many. Actually, we had quite a lot of discussions about that because, of course, people always ask me, this is so depressing, how can you keep on doing it without getting depressed? But I actually think that a lot of positive things have happened over just the last 5 years. First of all, and let me mention a few. Back in Katowice, I can't remember, it's 2017 or so, you had like a whole room of negotiators blocking everything because they couldn't agree whether they should welcome or acknowledge the IPCC 1.5 degree special report. Now you have all negotiating teams referring to the science and that everything is clear on the science side. So there's an acceptance and a whole different level of common understanding and reference for the negotiations, I think, which is an important sign. Then we've seen, 3 years ago, I would never have thought that we would have 3/4 of global emissions covered by net zero emission pledges by around the middle of the century. I would never believe that. And we also see that more and more countries engage. We have more countries that are making these pledges. We have more that are open to discussing how to raise ambition. But of course, we've seen incredible developments, for instance, in the cost of renewable energies over the past 15 years and only the past 5 years, always happening faster than expected. So on the whole cost scene, we've also seen now that renewable energy is cost competitive with fossil fuels in most places around the world. So I think there are many important positive signs, but we have not yet reached a stage where it's transmitted or shown in global emissions. If you look very carefully at the gap figure that I showed, and especially the one that there's a smaller part that goes further out to 2050, you will actually see that the scenarios here imply that global emissions will be peaking relatively soon, before 2030. And that's something we'll also look into more carefully in this year's emissions gap report. So I do think that there are positive signs, but we are not yet close to getting on track to the Paris Agreement goals, unfortunately.
So there's another, just a follow-up kind of on this question of on the bright side. So one of our associates says, it seems as though current commitments have averted 4 or 5 degrees of warming. Is that level of climate disaster no longer a significant risk? Or is this risk simply not captured in the way we're measuring NDCs? Is discussing runaway warming and climate thresholds still as relevant today as it was 10 years ago?
Let's start from the last point. Yes, I think the latest IPCC report, the Working Group 2 report that came out, clearly shows, and also Working Group 1 report on the science basis clearly shows that even at 1.5 degrees of warming, there will be significant risks, and that there are risks also of tipping points. As we approach 2 degrees of global warming, all of these risks increase, and that if we look at what they call the reasons for concern, which is basically how the risks are connected to global warming and different levels of global warming across key areas. We see in the new reports, or across all the IPCC reports, that these are more serious at lower temperatures and with higher confidence from each report to the subsequent report. So I do think it's a key concern. I'm not sure that we've shown that we have avoided 4 degrees. Well, yeah, some scenarios point to that 2010 policies would be aligned with 4 degrees of global warming at the end of the century, and we are now more heading towards 2.8, which is still way off target and would have unimaginable consequences, I think, for many of us in many parts of the world.
So that brings me to another question, which is, I mean, these are still voluntary commitments, right? So if we are, and there's a lot of theory about the power of voluntary commitments, but what do you see kind of in practice about how powerful voluntary commitments can be to meeting goals?
Yeah, I mean, they are voluntary commitments in the context of the UNFCCC, in the sense that there's no global authority that can enforce them, but these reflect policies and targets that are in law in many countries. So in that sense, they're not voluntary. So they are backed up with something more solid. So I think that, combined with, of course, other avenues such as pressure from other stakeholders, but also, as we see, developments in technologies and costs that will, I'm quite certain, keep making low carbon transition basically the best business case. So I think combined, that is how we can move ahead.
Great. And then a question, just I think maybe based on something you said a couple of minutes ago, how much confidence is there concerning global emissions inventories? So really looking at kind of your error bars.
What we use in the report, so global inventories, there's been a lot of discussion about the national inventories, I think. I'm not going to go into that, but what we use in the report is basically, as it's an assessment report, we look into a lot, or we use data from a lot of different modeling teams to make sure that we have as good as a range as possible. But of course, there are large error bars. You saw the in the gap figure, the shaded area indicates this uncertainty or the variation that might be in around each of the solid lines. So there are large uncertainties.
Yeah, of course. This is a great question also. Are there shared tools countries use for assessing on-the-ground logistical constraints to commitments? So things like estimates of buildings that need to be renovated or EV charging stations needed kind of on an annual basis to reach these goals?
I'm not aware of shared tools, but I mean, there's so much
Neither.
collaboration going on. So, I mean, I would imagine that there would be tools available to share at least, and also increasingly countries are exchanging information and best practices and good practices. But I'm not aware of any specific tools and how they're shared.
And then do you anticipate emissions reductions in certain industries or systems due to changes that were made during COVID-19?
I think it's again, I think it's different depending on where we are in the world. So for instance, we're just finalizing a report for the Nordic Council of Ministers where we look more into also the Nordic countries, and they have actually allocated quite a large share of the fiscal recovery funding to green measures. So I think in some countries it might help accelerate, and it's very much related to energy, of course, energy use in a broad sense. Transport, I don't think not so much. We've also seen examples of where the COVID rescue and recovery packages have actually supported non-clean development.
Yeah, right. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, here's the question. What use seems to be most risky to achieve emissions reductions? I think the question is really maybe indicating the transportation on a sectoral basis, the transportation sector. A question about that.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
So I think the question is what uses seem to be most risky to achieve emissions reduction? So I think what are the most difficult sectors to decarbonize?
Well, I think we have a lot of the answers right now, both for energy and transport. Actually, it's the huge challenge now. What needs to happen is electrification of all the sectors that we can. And of course renewable electrification. So I think the more complicated sectors, if we move to industry, where some of these processes are not easily electrified, so there will be emissions there that it's difficult to decarbonize completely. We can also see in some sectors where there's ample opportunity, actually, such as land use and forestry. There are policy changes that can upturn the developments quite easily. But I think if we look into difficult sectors, it's the ones that are more difficult to electrify.
And then there's a question kind of at least related to that, and acknowledging that this might be a little too specific, but do you have any sense of how useful the deployment of capital to green hydrogen projects will be in hard to electrify sectors?
I think there is a huge potential and high hopes. I think it's difficult to say still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then a question from Angela, do you anticipate that the need for some countries to allocate investments for adaptation may further delay investments for mitigation? I mean, this comes up, this conversation comes up a lot through the COP process.
Yeah, it does. And I've heard, people saying that they don't really approve of having an equal split between funding for mitigation and adaptation in the $100 billion goal and so forth. But I think it's important to remember that funding comes from many different sources. So if we're talking climate change adaptation, of course, adaptation is difficult to fund in many ways, especially through private finance and so forth. So I think we're talking about different parts of funding here, and that overall, I don't think that allocating more funding to adaptation would necessarily have detrimental effects on mitigation, because by now we have a business case for so many investments that lead to lower emissions that it shouldn't be an issue. Same way.
This is a good question. In terms of pathways, are there policies that are considered risky in terms of providing short-term emissions reductions, but perhaps closing pathways for deeper reductions in the longer term? And I guess also maybe the converse, right, where you have long-term emissions, but or long-term commitments, but no short-term returns on those commitments.
I'm not sure I quite understood that question either, sorry.
I think it's saying, so are there specific policy pathways, right, that might be able to provide a short-term return, right, on an emissions reduction, but that would close out opportunities for deeper emissions reductions in the longer term? So maybe something like an over-reliance on gas in the short term, which would provide reductions, but isn't necessarily going to provide the long-term deep emissions reductions that we're going to need in the future.
Yeah, I think one thing that needs to happen, of course, is that a lot of the technologies that are required in the longer term needs huge investments now that are uncertain and not secure in any way. So basically, there will be investments that we need to make that will not have any immediate effects, but are essential for decarbonizing, for instance, the sectors that are hard to abate right now, and also to go into net negative or negative emissions later in the century. So it's more if you miss out on that now, and we can see with the carbon dioxide removal technologies how long it's actually taken. There's been so much discussion about these technologies for the past 20 years, but very little progress made in reality in terms of really demonstrating their potential at a larger scale. So this takes time, and we need huge investments in technology development and research. Apart from that, it's mainly if policy pathways prevent more efficient or emission reductions in the longer term, as you just mentioned. If you're just substituting from one fossil fuel to another, of course, that's not optimal in any way.
Sure.
And of course, if you're locking in infrastructure, so you can do, for instance, in buildings, mitigation measures that do result in emission reductions, but maybe are not optimal, and also lock in because of the long life spans of the investments. Yeah,
that's a great answer. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here to ask the last question, because we're just coming to the end of our hour. So this is not a hard question, I hope, but I'm wondering if you can tell us, and the participants who are joined us today, what is the best thing that you've read on this topic, could be a book, whatever, in the last year, that you would recommend if people are interested in kind of future carbon mitigation, global carbon mitigation? What do you suggest that they read?
Well, it's not out yet, but I would suggest at least reading the summary for policymakers of the forthcoming Working Group 3 IPCC report on mitigation. That's good.
That's coming out April 4th, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and also depending on specific interest, the relevant chapters of that report, I think that will be interesting. Maybe not. It will probably also help you fall asleep if you read it right before bedtime. but definitely, I'm looking forward to seeing the final versions, at least.
So over your morning coffee. This was fantastic. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I want to thank everybody who joined us. And I want to remind you all to go to our website to sign up for both the Energy Week, April 4th through 8th, and also for our Carnot Prize on April 19th. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye now.
Thank you.